Hello, brain-damaged philosopher here. Since I covered John Rawls yesterday, I think it would be only fair for me to cover my criticisms of his philosophical opponent, Robert Nozick, today, especially since I mentioned Robert Nozick's criticisms of John Rawls in my own video. Robert Nozick is also far closer to my views on politics and ethics than Rawls is, so I think it would be a much more interesting exercise for me to explain where I agree and where I disagree with Robert Nozick. Especially since Robert Nozick's philosophy is actually far more complicated and intricate and has a much stronger through line than Rawls is. It also means that since Nozick is only in part responding to Rawls and in larger part responding to Rothbard, doing this video would open up a natural avenue for me to talk about my criticisms of Murray Rothbard's ethics and politics. So to begin with, Anarchy, State, and Utopia was one of the first philosophy books that I actually read, and it is a very dense and pretty long book, so I'm not going to be able to cover all of the things that Robert Nozick says in it that I might disagree with or that might in some way contribute to the overall milieu of the book. For instance, I'm going to be taking largely for granted his idea that ethics should be based around side constraints on action, even though he has a number of interesting philosophical thought experiments and points that he uses to establish that, which I'm not sure are entirely successful, but which would make interesting things to cover in their own videos. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on the main through line of Robert Nozick's argument. Now, it's also important to note that when Nozick is setting out his ethical philosophy, which then he turns into his political philosophy through the course of the book, almost every sentence in those incredibly dense chapters is in some way used to get him, used as part of the argument that he makes in favor of the minimal state. It's almost like every side point, every consideration that he brings up eventually comes back around. So I'm going to be doing my best to remember all of the cases where that happens and give you the relevant information in order to provide the strongest replay of his argument as possible, but I might miss a few things. So I greatly encourage you to go read his book if you can. So yeah, I'm going to be spending roughly the first half of this video just laying out Nozick's argument, and then I'll get into what my problems with it are. So basically, Nozick begins with the idea that utilitarianism isn't enough to guide our moral actions because it doesn't take seriously the separateness and individuality and separate interests of different people. He says that if you make one person unhappy in order to make two people happy, there's no, group organism or, ontological connection between those people that makes it so that you've actually made more of one thing or made one thing happier overall. Instead, all you've necessarily done is just made one person unhappy so that two other people can be happy. This is similar to Bentham's point in one of his previously unpublished letters to a friend, where he says that although utilitarianism is a useful guide to public policy, he agrees that it doesn't really necessarily make sense to think of one person's happiness and another person's happiness as fundamentally fungible quantities that can be exchanged without noticing any difference. The way he puts it is that it's not as if he has, 3 apples from one person and 1 apple from another, and when he puts them together, he has 4 apples. It may, in fact, be the case, and he seems to think that it actually is, aside from any heuristics that he might use for public policy, that what really happens is you get 3 apples from one person and 1 pear from another. And when you put them together, you've still got 3 apples and 1 pear. Robert Nozick seems to be of that opinion as well. So while he thinks that utilitarianism as an aggregated extension of empathy might be a good way to generally guide your actions, you should put side constraints on what you can do in order to respect the individuality and therefore the individual lives and ends and values of other people. This is similar to the second formulation of Kant's categorical imperative, in that we should always treat other people as ends in themselves instead of merely as means. Although Robert Nozick's sort of interpretation of what this means is far less demanding than Kant's, as Kant seems to introduce the idea of pure altruism as a necessary component of action. Now, what are these side constraints? Well, Robert Nozick basically comes up with the idea that if you do something to another without their permission, that puts them lower on what he calls the indifference curve, which is basically a measure of whether someone desires a change to be made in their situation, where being at just the right position on the indifference curve, at the center of the hump, means that you don't desire a change in your situation. And, being put lower or higher on it means that you do. So basically he says that if you do something to another without their permission that puts them lower on the indifference curve, then it becomes your responsibility to restore them to the same spot on the indifference curve. Essentially, it's an idea of restitutive justice or victim-based justice, where if you coerce someone, use violence or the threat of violence or something along those lines on them, then you have a responsibility to make it right to their satisfaction. Now, he says that essentially you can't trust what someone tells you about where they are in the indifference curve, because they could always have a motivation to tell you that they're unhappy for much longer than they would otherwise in order to get more out of you than you took away from them. So he says that a simple way to estimate the actual values of the indifference curve is to use, monetary or material, objective material possessions, or health, or which can be included in like a material possession of your own body or something like that. He also says that property, and he talks about this in relation to Rawls's theory of distributive justice. He talks about his own theory of historical justice and entitlement in property rights, where basically part of the side constraints, part of the definition of doing something to someone else without their permission that Nozick has in those side constraints is an idea of property, where he doesn't specify how property can be originally acquired, although he expresses some doubts about Lockean labor mixing. But he says that there should be some way to do it, and maybe homesteading is the way, or something like that. And but once you have property, it's all about whether it's voluntarily given or traded for, and so on. Once he lays this basic foundation, he goes on to say that this conception of property rights is basically very, very strict, right? Like the opening sentences of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, where he says, there are some things that nobody may do to anyone without violating their rights, is actually a pretty good indication of, at least in the beginning, how strict Nozick's conception of rights are. So then he asks, with this very strict conception of rights, how much room is there really left for a state? Because the way a state operates is through determining, what people will do and exacting justice and redistributing resources. And those are the kinds of things that would, you would assume be outlawed by such a strict conception of rights. So after pointing this out, Nozick goes into a few instances where this conception of rights might have sort of an exception. So for one thing, he talks about the idea of it being morally permissible to violate someone's rights as long as you give them restitution. So normally in a rights-based system, it's never okay to violate someone's rights, but if you do it, you still have to give restitution, even though that doesn't absolve you of the moral blame. In Rawls' conception, however, he believes that there are some conditions under which someone's rights, especially to property, must be violated in order to achieve a great enough utilitarian end. So, for instance, if a whole population of people will starve unless they trespass on your property, then you might be able to ask the owner if they would consent to that, and maybe it would not be moral to do so if they did not consent. But in some situations, they wouldn't be available to consent, and the gain is great enough that you might assume that they would consent if they were there, and you simply don't have time to wait for them to come back. So it's this kind of nuanced thing where it's not as if you can break the side constraints if the utilitarian benefit is great enough, or at least you can't directly break them in direct contradiction to, what a person desires. So you can't explicitly coerce people. But if there's sort of this gray area where it's, you don't really know if it's against their will or not, you can get, wiggle room. And so what Nozick says is that in such a situation where there's this wiggle room, you can make it okay no matter what the owner says after the fact, as long as you give them restitution for whatever breaking of the side constraints that you did. Or not breaking, but whatever, trespass of their rights that you did. Another sort of exception is Nozick points out that risk is, by his definition, an unasked for influence on someone's indifference curve. Because again, Nozick doesn't explicitly define the side constraints in terms of a violation of person or property. He defines them in terms of an unasked for modification of someone's indifference curve. Although what kind of modifications count is somewhat related to, at least it seems to me, person and property. It's not explicitly just that. And so he points out that if you're imposing a risk on someone, that's actually something that can make them unhappy and therefore affect their indifference curve. And so you need to get permission for that, or if you can't get permission, because you can't be constantly asking everyone for permission for what, for everything you do, then you should at least give them some kind of restitution. But importantly, for great enough imposed risks, that kind of restitution isn't really possible. Because imagine, and this is an example he gives, you've been told that at any time someone might walk up to you on the street and break your arm, right? And you don't know when or where or how many times it will happen, but you know for a fact that it will happen at some point. Or, there's a very high risk of it. So it's a bad outcome and there's a very high risk. And so as you're walking around the streets of your city, you'll be very afraid. And even if with that threat, someone tells you that they'll not only pay all the medical bills for repairing your arm, but they'll actually, pay you double that to ensure that you get, profits on it, that still won't make you any less nervous about the risk. And so there are some, risks that actually can't be compensated for, and so those actually do have to be stopped. So this is the justification he gives actually for the idea that drunk driving should be illegal. So with those two with that general understanding of the ethical system within which Nozick is operating established, we can move on to the real meat of his argument for the minimal state. Essentially, what Nozick says is that if you take what is generally understood to be the easiest system to fit into a sort of semi-libertarian, hardline, rights-based conception, which is the Rothbardian system of private protection agencies and anarcho-capitalism, if you take that system and actually play it out, so you start in a state of anarchy, you will eventually, by a sort of invisible hand process wherein every single individual step does not violate rights, end up with a minimal state. And since every individual step, that gets you to the state, to that minimal state, does not violate rights, then the minimal state itself can't violate rights. Because the central idea of libertarian rights is that it's historical. That, something is fine as long as it's arrived at by, voluntary, non-coercive, non-side constraint breaking means. And his argument essentially goes like this. Let's say you have a whole population of protection agencies, right? With people subscribed to so you have these, essentially private police forces that people pay, a yearly or monthly fee to in order to protect them. And then those agencies, in case they might come into conflict, they realize that, well, it's very expensive to have conflict because we actually have to convince our paying customers that conflict was worth it. And most of the time they won't be involved in the conflict. It'll be only like one or two that are. It's actually safer and more cost-effective to come up with agreements with the other protection agencies so that instead of having to fight out a conflict, if, two or more of, if, a customer of one agency and a customer of another get into a disagreement and both call in their respective protection agencies, it's actually better to have an agreement ahead of hand that actually specifies what should happen in that situation and maybe goes to a court or something like that, right? And, in that system, Nozick says that eventually there will come a point where some protection agencies will come into armed conflict. And when they do, the agency that loses that conflict will automatically lose all of its customers because those customers will want to subscribe to the agency that actually, is able to win in any conflict, right? And so whenever there's any conflict, you get this sort of, you get a reduction in the number of agencies and, this sort of absorption, right? And so almost by necessity, you'll end up with fewer agencies than you started with eventually. And he seems to think that, on the one hand, the pre-written agreements that I mentioned, and that's very important in most anarcho-capitalist and market anarchist theory, wouldn't actually be very effective in preventing this armed conflict, because he doesn't seem to think that there would actually be that big of a disincentive for armed conflict between protection agencies. And he also seems to think that in the cases where those agreements do stick around, you can essentially consider the two agencies that have that agreement as a single agency because they're both beholden to a single decision process. And so what begins to happen is that sort of by natural market processes, you'll end up with very few agencies, and even the agencies that do exist operate almost like a single agency. Now we get into an interesting equilibrium state where, and before, as that happens, before I move on, Nozick also says that it's difficult to project power, and so these agencies and groups of agencies will tend to have territory-based jurisdictions that will look a lot like, states, where, they have different borders agreed upon and stuff like that. And, once this has happened, any agency that believes that another agency is enforcing or following a procedure of law and enforcement that imposes an undue risk on people of having their side constraints violated unjustly has a moral right to actually suppress that agency. Because if you believe that an agency is imposing a risk of being unjust on people, then that's the kind of risk that's not compensatable, and that's pretty large, and so it would justify it's actually violating side constraints already, because it's decreasing people's place on their indifference curves without their permission just by existing, and so you can actually use force to make them stop existing. And now any agency has the right to do that. So even if you have many small agencies, they would all have the right to do that. But that would be difficult because, maybe they're all roughly equal size, or, if a big one starts trying to do that to little ones, they'd all gang up and stop it. But once you get to a point where there's only really one big agency, then it is the single most powerful agency. And so any new agency that are going to start up can be stopped immediately, just because the agency, by definition, can't trust another agency's decision procedure for enacting justice as much as its own, because it's selected its own because it believes that's the best option. And so what you'll get is, even though the new biggest agency that's been generated doesn't have any special rights, it still gets to do something that the little agencies didn't do before this process of conglomeration happened, just by nature of its sheer size. And this is basically how we end up with the ultra-minimal state, where essentially you have what Nozick considers a single big big protection agency that has a territorial limit that can stop other protection agencies from arising in that territory. So now the big difference between this and the minimal state is that there can still be people that don't actually subscribe to this big protection agency. They can just choose to be on their own and enforce their own justice, right? But of course, that's not acceptable, because someone enforcing their own justice, being their own protection agency, is basically a loose cannon vigilante. And that imposes the same kind of risk as, new protection agencies popping up. And so, of course, the big central ultra-minimal state can force them to stop, enforcing their own justice. But now the problem is, now the big ultra-minimal state is actually imposing a risk on these people, because if they don't subscribe to it, and it's not allowing any other protection agencies, and it's also not allowing them to defend themselves, they're basically open to anyone who wants to steal, murder, kill, or anything like that. So then that's the kind of risk that can actually be compensated simply by providing a service of protection. And so the ultra-minimal state becomes the minimal state by stopping individuals from, willy-nilly self-defense, but then also, when they do that, providing those individuals with defense of its own, like a defense package of its own. And then, of course, this minimal state can't really be expected to do that for free. So, of course, it can ask a discounted price from those people. And now, importantly, Nozick also mentions that part of the reason that the state has to compensate these people is not just because they now can't defend themselves, but because their right to choose who they can get protection from has been taken away by the ultra minimal state. And so that's part of the reason, that puts them lower on their indifference curves, obviously, because they chose not to subscribe to the ultra minimal state. And so that's another reason the ultra minimal state has to compensate them with its own defense package and thereby become the minimal state. All right, so yeah, that's Nozick's argument. So now to get into the problems. So to begin with, this idea that So the problem with the idea that risk imposed on people is something that can be a violation of side constraints is problematic, because either the violation of side constraints is really based on person and property, and the indifference curve is just a way of talking about the measurement of how bad the violation is, or any unasked for modification of the indifference curve is a violation of side constraints. I mentioned earlier that it seems to be some kind of unclear conglomeration of the two, but it's really either or. Either it's the indifference curve that defines when side constraints have been violated, or it's not. And if it's just person and property that define the edges of side constraints, then risk isn't a violation of person and property. The whole definition of risk is that the violation hasn't happened yet. And if it's based purely on the indifference curve, then almost anything you can do to someone else can change where they are in their indifference curve, and therefore, be a violation of side constraints that would require some kind of restitution. If I walk by someone with mismatched clothes that make them feel, terrible because it's just not aesthetically pleasing, now do I have to compensate them? If I happen to, say something and someone is already really depressed, and so, they take it the wrong way and suddenly they're feeling suicidal, like, should I be, executed or something? So it already here, Nozick is caught between two horns of a dilemma, where he has to choose one or the other. And if he chooses the former option, his argument for the ultra minimal state collapses, because at best, without the right to suppress the smaller and newer protection agencies, his argument just establishes that there wouldn't be that many protection agencies. And on the other hand, if he chooses the other side of the dilemma, then we're basically back to utilitarianism, except way harsher and with all kinds of very dubious consequences. And since Robert Nozick seems to be operating on some form of ethical intuitionism, I don't think he'd be willing to accept that. But I think it gets worse for him, because this idea that, if someone's rights are violated, then it can just be okay as long as you compensate them afterwards. As long as they didn't explicitly say no beforehand, is kind of a problem, because, so let's say, someone's how, you don't like someone, right? So you burn down their house while they're not there. Well, obviously they didn't explicitly tell you that, not to burn down their house. And so when they get back, as long as you pay them for the full value of the house and everything in it, it's perfectly fine. But that doesn't really fix the problem, because now they don't have a house. Now they have to go buy another one. But there are more problems, because for one thing, I disagree with Nozick on how often real armed conflict would occur between protection agencies. See, for his idea that you'd end up with a single or a very few protection agencies to work, he needs this process of, a bigger protection agency defeating a smaller one to happen a lot and very often. If you start out with 10 protection agencies and it happens, once every 10 years, that's 100 years before you get down to one. And without the risk part of that, you'll have new protection agencies popping up all the time. He also forgets that there might be reasons to stick with a protection agency that lost a single battle. Because think about it. The different protection agencies might offer different laws to apply between people that both signed up for the same protection agency. And they might offer different packages. There might be some kind of brand loyalty as well. Just because a agency loses a battle once doesn't mean it'll lose a battle every time. There are a lot of variables to who wins a battle when. And just the fact that, even engaging with a smaller force, you might lose, and then, let's ignore that for a bit and say that Nozick is right. And every time an agency loses a battle, all of its customers go to the other agency. Well, there are a lot of variables to a fight. And so, it would be risky to engage in a battle with another agency because you might lose everything if you lose that battle. And so that's a whole nother gigantic cost to add to, why agencies wouldn't fight in the first place. That's not to mention just the economic factors and the public relations factors that would factor into not wanting to have battles all the time. If Bill Clinton himself, or to use, a very outdated at this point Rothbard quote, had to pay every time he launched a, ICBM, out of pocket and couldn't simply show up with guns and force everyone to pay for it, that's a very expensive proposition after a while. And it might, if the idea is that you're going to get into a fight every time there's a conflict between two people who have different protection agencies, it wouldn't be worth it because that single person isn't going to be paying enough to make up for the lost, all the damages, all the spent ammunition, all the killed people. It would be better to just lose that one customer. Of course, if they did that every time, they'd lose all their customers, so they'd have to do it, once in a while, have to have the ability to do it. But the best way to make that trade-off, without having to figure out the exact point at which they've fought for enough people that people aren't going to leave, but few enough where it doesn't cost them too much, is to have the appearance of being able to back up their contracts and stuff, but focus on making those agreement contracts with the other agencies. And so, already we've come to the point where we're not even going to make it to the ultra minimal state, let alone the minimal state, just because that process of, whittling down the number of protection agencies and preventing new ones is completely hobbled at this point. And, that's not to mention Nozick's sort of offhand remark that agencies that have an agreement between each other essentially count as the same government. Because you forget that an agency essentially has two different sets of laws. The sets of laws for its customers when they're interacting with other agencies, and those laws are agreed to on a mutual basis with those other agencies. And then the sets of laws that it enforces between its customers that both subscribe to the same agency. And it's those internal laws are actually, really important. And so even if two agencies, have an agreement, they'll actually, they could enforce very different laws internally on their own customers. And those customers would have a say on, what those laws are in a way that they wouldn't have over what the laws enforced between agencies or in the other agency are. And the other thing is that, let's say you have three agencies, and they, agency A, agency B, and agency C. Agency A and B have an agreement, agency B and C have an agreement, and agency A and C have an agreement. Well, the agreements between each of those agencies, so agreement AB, BC, and AC, might all, have very different properties. And so it wouldn't feel like being part of the same, governmental system, because depending on who you interact with, the laws might be pretty different. And, you wouldn't really necessarily have a complete say over it. It would be far more like, a sort of, an extradition agreement or something between countries than anything else. And I'm sure Nozick doesn't think that, two countries are the same country just because they have an extradition, agreement or something like that. Additionally, the idea that agencies would be, strictly tied down to a single territorial area is just silly. An agency doesn't care where, an agency doesn't care if enforcers from another agency are intermingled with them, as long as they don't, enforce things on, people from their agency. There's no reason also that an agency couldn't have, multiple headquarters and franchises around a country or around the world. In fact, that would be very profitable. So even though I've pretty much dismantled the ultra minimal state, let's talk about the minimal state for a bit, because there are other problems here. First of all, we have the problem of disallowing people to enforce their own justice is removed, if we disagree with Nozick on risk. But we can, we talked about that. We can lay that aside. But the idea that a person can be compensated for losing their ability to choose how they are defended by being given a package of defense from an agency that they very specifically did not buy a package from, that's why they're being given this package in the first place, is silly. Rothbard basically says that as long as there's a single anarcho-capitalist out there, Nozick couldn't achieve his minimal state morally, because nothing that could, be given to them to compensate for the terrible loss of, a free market anarchist society. And it's a farce to think that they could be compensated for the loss of that society by being given a package from the new government that's just arisen. That's what killed off that society in the first place. The other problem with the minimal state is that once it's achieved, there's really no reason that it couldn't grow. Because, again, we return to the problem of what the side constraints really are, and it's not very clear. Nozick gives some arguments as to why the minimal state shouldn't expand any further once it's been achieved, talking about how any conception of distributive justice must necessarily impinge on liberty. But I'm not sure that I find those convincing if we don't really understand the limits of the side constraints in the first place. And the fact that, those side constraints are already, at least for Nozick, fairly easy to stretch. If you consider the risk and the idea that you can violate someone's rights as long as you compensate them. I mean, right there, that's eminent domain in a nutshell, right? So now we've got a libertarian government that can do eminent domain. But the other thing is that by using the same logic as Nozick uses to say that, taking away the person's right to choose how they are defended is okay as long as they're given a package, from the government that they don't like, as long as that package gives them defense, however they feel about that. You can use that same logic to say, well, if you take taxes from people, as long as they get a benefit from those taxes, even if they don't want that benefit, don't like that they got it, and wouldn't have asked for it, it's fine. Then you can basically get as large a government as you want, because you can pretty much justify anything by saying that, oh, well, it actually gives a benefit to everyone in the long run. There's an interesting inconsistency here, too, because Nozick seems to forget the feelings of, Rothbard's posited anarcho-capitalist when it comes to establishing the minimal state. But when it comes to talking about risk, feelings are the whole core of the argument. The feeling of being afraid that's very difficult to compensate for. And so, the thing that's causing the feeling has to be removed instead. And so, in the end, Nozick is, like Rawls, a very crunchy thinker. He has something that he wants to justify, and he thinks he can come by that justification honestly. And so he constructs this very interesting kind of, fairly logical looking step-by-step reasoning for it with a lot of moving parts and interesting, thought experiments, and, eventually arrives at the thing that he wanted. But if you actually look at the way that, he's doing it, it breaks down on nearly every level. And so, in the end, I think Rawls and Nozick are basically sort of the flip side to each other, in that they're both cases where you get a thinker who's obviously very intelligent, very willing to go into a lot of thought to figure out and justify something they want justified. But they've already started with the conclusion they want. And so they're going to get there by any means necessary. And it's only because of their relative intelligence and relative commitment to process that we get anything interesting out of them at all.